Well, hello there. My goodness, are you guys looking particularly competent today? So, before we actually get started, ladies and gentlemen, because I think there's going to be quite a lot of deep stuff we're going to be talking about, or at least the sort of things that really need to be accompanied by a disclaimer, I thought then in order to sort of like cheer everybody up, I thought we were going to start with, something a little bit more light-hearted. Do something that, maybe, just maybe, will help change your perspective on things, and maybe, just maybe again, will actually come together in the spirit of dubious, light-hearted comedy. Because sometimes you do need to, like, take a step back and to try to, like, take all the good things in life. And sometimes, with the benefit of hindsight, sometimes some of the things you do are actually quite funny, inadvertently. Not everything, but most of the things you do. Whether or not even people like Chris likes to admit it or not. What isn't okay, however, is like the sort of repercussions that it causes in your mind. But literally, when it comes to things like mental health care, here is how bad my mental health is right now. You want to know what's... Because I have literally lost all perspective of time, ladies and gentlemen, because the only productive thing I think I've done all of today, outside of going to work, going to the gym, actually putting together a business plan, actually writing about a 1,400-page essay in terms of how on earth I'm going to tackle this, how I've set out a budget, how I set out a tugboat, outside of, planning thumbnails, organizing, outside, just basic stuff. Do you know what the most productive thing I feel like I've done today? Is that when I left the house this morning, literally to start work at 7 o'clock in the morning, I literally thought of the idea of doing an April Fool's Day video in which I came up with this new language called Faki. Have you ever heard of Faki before, ladies and gentlemen? Oh, you should. It's fantastic. And literally, if people ever at any point cross me and whether or not they wanted to know what I would say, I'll just make up some dumb shit by saying what it translates to. It means I really fucking hate Italians or something like that. Something that literally everybody can sort of come together and say they probably deserve it anyway. But what do I know? Hey, and by the way, if you are Italian out there and you feel in some way offended by this, good. It does good, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes to feel that you're a little bit personally attacked every so often. Because guess what? We're not perfect. Nobody at any point has the right to start saying that they don't have that right, ladies and gentlemen, to be conventionally challenged on them thinking that they are literally the best at everything in the world. That's called taking your ego down a few pegs. Albeit with a fair degree of harsh prejudice, because sometimes I feel like, even by Chris's standards, he goes after people with more victimization than probably even I do to myself. But that's what happens, ladies and gentlemen, when you have no fucking respect for yourself whatsoever. Prepare to hear that a couple of times. And prepare for to hear me say that a couple of times too, because who the fuck said I had to be consistent on my own channel? Exactly. I mean, where? I mean, what else are you gonna do? Go to a different YouTube channel? Like, why not go visit a dead one instead? Do you think they're gonna come back for the dead? Hello, Dylan Thomas, is that you? Maybe he's hiding in my closet somewhere or something like that. I don't know. I shouldn't slag Dylan Thomas off and all that, because literally his girlfriend is he still going out with Tricky? Anyway, the point, I commissioned her to do a small art piece for me a couple of years ago, so yeah, I can't say many bad things about him. I'll say that much. God Almighty, was there anything else? Anything else I wanted to talk about before we got started? Oh yeah, you're gonna love this joke, ladies and gentlemen. This one is going to fucking knock you out. Ready? Don't go around slagging off Quickville. I went to Quickville last week. It was closed. Right. Are we all ready now? Can we actually get started? Yes, we can. Chris and mental health care. My current church can help me a lot. Better than any professional, because God and Jesus supports them as well. So if they support you, if they support him, so why are you not taking their advice, Chris? So what you're trying, Chris, are you trying to say that priests are better professionals when it comes to mental health than people who are who have legitimate degrees. But then again, a priest does sort of hold that level of responsibility. But as you're about to see, this kind of flip-flops pretty quick. Because this is Chris in 2008. This is Chris 10 years later. I am only going to say this once for any of those who think me as delusional, crazy, or some shit like that. I am not delusional, crazy, or anything of the sort. I have my own magic powers that I am still learning about for myself and my family and allies. I've already talked with psychiatrists and therapists years ago, so any new such meetings would be a very moot point. I mean, yeah, I know what you're probably thinking. This doesn't even look particularly like on the level itself, but well, if this is not on the level, then this is literally going down a level. We are going down depletion chromosome zone. So yeah, not looking good. Chris has a troubled relationship with mental health professionals. He doesn't have one, that's probably why. Both psychologists and psychiatrics. He claims that he was held down by the school psychologist in grade school. Wait, he was held down. Like, who was he? Dr. fucking Octopus. In grade school while his screams were recorded, and was forced to see a psychologist for anger management classes after being kicked out of Piedmont, Virginia Community College. Considering what Chris would do years later, it didn't seem to do any good whatsoever, did it? So that is the one L I'll take towards PVCC, is that, well, these courses literally did nothing, but probably just wasting the taxpayers' money on trying to get Chris to, you know, not do the things that he was doing before, except slightly more of that. Chris has refused to see a psychologist of his own volition in the past, opting to see Rocky Shoemaker, his pastoral counsellor, instead. The sole exception occurred in 2016, when Chris went to a gender psychologist over his transgender issues. Chris's various runs-in with the law have resulted in mandated therapy, such as the therapeutic docket. However, Chris has failed to adjust his behaviour for such reasons. And, well, the reasons are, well, the problems with Chris in his own mind. Well, I could sum up this whole thing, ladies and gentlemen, with very simply is that Chris thinks he's perfect, therefore he can get away with doing anything he wants, just as long as he is actually bothered to do it. And when he isn't actually bothered to do it, he will blame everybody and his own mom for doing it, or for at least pseudo holding him back for thinking that only he can be right. There you are. I've solved it. You know, it's a good thing that probably they won't hire me as a psychologist anytime soon, because I think there's also the difference between there's like meeting people halfway, and then there's you just state the cold hard facts to somebody. It may seem hurtful, it may seem that I'm picking on them, it may seem as if it's literally just telling them everything they don't want to hear, but guess what? Is it right or is it wrong, though? Because Chris, let's be honest right now, and I'll get to this when we talk about Chris's ego. Chris has such a huge issue in admitting whenever he's wrong. One of the biggest things, ladies and gentlemen, you will come to know when it comes to being an adult is that whether you like it or not, and you are even more liable, ladies and gentlemen, for falling through the system if you don't take accountability or responsibility for your actions. Everything is now. This is like how it is just for adults generally. When you are on the internet, however, it is like you are putting yourself under a microscope, in which articles like this exist, videos like this exist, and plenty of YouTubers left, right, and center will also hop on the bandwagon, literally just to say what we've already known. But if there's that many people saying it, but then again, it's also because Chris doesn't watch these videos, then what's in Chris's mind? What exactly do you expect he was going to do? Listen to people give him a hard time because Chris has caught on to the fact that he's a very controversial figure online? Or what do you think he's going to do? Is he actually going to go towards people who are sort of trying to meet him halfway? Like, I even think trying to, like, meet Chris halfway is very problematic, because any sort of praise that is warranted or anything you can give Chris is almost kind of cancelled out to such an extent that you almost feel kind of bad for trying to meet people like Chris halfway. It's the same reason why you don't meet people like Uncle Gums halfway, because you need to remember what people like Uncle Gums are like, because they are not safe people. And trying to meet them halfway means that you could agree with them on some things, but you can't disagree with them. You give people like that leniency. And unfortunately with Chris, you can't give people like Chris leniency, because the people that do give Chris leniency are the sort of people who will just allow this to continue. And considering some things that have happened in recent years, not investigating or clamping down harder on Chris sooner resulted in things that, well, are almost unspeakable. Just saying. Chris claims to be autistic, homophobic as a genuine phobia, and a victim of noviophobia, a made-up phobia of girls having boyfriends. He also diagnosed himself with dissociative identity disorder in the August 30th captain's log. Yeah, self-diagnosis, ladies and gentlemen. Trust me, that doesn't exist. It's not a. It's something that in the realm of like psychology, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't exist. Because how can you go out of your way to say you are this, that, and the other without a professional diagnosis or reasons to suggest that, guess what, your behaviour is more reflective on having a bad couple of days and stuff like that? Because think about it like this: when did Chris bring stuff like that up? Before or after? Which is also a bit of a... I don't know whether or not inconsistency is also like a mental disorder, but it's the sort of thing that Chris should have like kept up to date about, because these things too get written down in some capacity. Although he later revealed in Mailbag 4 that it was a lie to momentarily derail the trolls. I mean, yeah, my point exactly. While you may be asking yourself, ladies and gentlemen, why doesn't Chris just ignore the trolls altogether? And if the trolls legitimately don't meet Chris halfway, and if they don't catch the eye of his attention, then Chris wouldn't have nearly as much of the problems. Well, some of them, if it wasn't when the trolls don't interfere. Unfortunately, we know that's not the case, because, well, what justifiable reason is there for Chris to respond to trolls in the first place? Considering Chris's history, you would have thought Chris would have had a particularly strong grasp on trying to discern those who are real and those who are not. Once again, Chris proved that he had no understanding of how serious mental disorders can be. Pretending to be crazy is an odd sort of catch-22. Well, why is Chris pretending? Pretending? No, we know Chris is not crazy. I think Chris at times doesn't really qualify as either like good or evil, because honestly, at times I think Chris qualifies as a friggin' maniac with his behavior. But that's, you see, you and I, you guys already knew that, and yet legitimately even after all this time I don't care, so where's the surprise, eh? It's no secret that Chris has always had a very childish mindset and views growing up as some sort of epic arduous challenge. No, Chris only makes it an arduous challenge because Chris's habits, physically as well as mentally, are basically, it's like having two massive anchors strapped around your neck that he'd put there on purpose because of his actions, cause and effect and all that. But it wasn't until a conversation with Casey that we knew just how serious this was. According to Chris, as a child, he never had any serious idea of what he wanted to be when he grew up, something all healthy children consider at one point or another. Nor did the thought of becoming an adult ever truly cross his mind. This implies that Chris may have thought that he would remain a child forever. Chris also seems to be at a level of incompetence that prevents him from realizing how incompetent he is. A Cornell University psychology journal details this phenomenon. When people are incompetent in the strategies they adopt to achieve success and satisfaction, they suffer a dual burden. Not only do they reach erroneous conclusions and make unfortunate choices, but their incompetence robs them of the ability to realize it. You could almost suggest, ladies and gentlemen, is that, well, to sort of present this in another way, is that Chris has chosen a profession, aka solitude, in which it is impossible to grow rich and impossible to become successful because of the minefield of failure legally when it comes to solitude being classed as a parody, as Chris puts it, and, well, that's just the fundamental aspect of solitude as a fictional entity. You have to also take into consideration the dubious messages that Chris actually sends in his comics, the writing, the art style, the distribution, the erroneous reputation that precedes the comics, knowing what we know far too much of Chris anyway. It's a bit like, how many of you guys ever heard of the comic book writer Orson Scott Card? Well, you may, for those who don't, he spent a lot of time. I think he was like working for Marvel. I think at some point. The important details to know is that he was massively homophobic, and Marvel seemed to be doing an incredible amount of work to try to justify or rationalize Orson's views, but they let him go anyway. Or it's the same thing with like Frank Miller, who, for those who don't honestly remember, Frank Miller was the man who drew as well as wrote The Dark Knight Returns, widely considered by many to be the greatest Batman story of them all. Now, even though I do prefer, I do think The Killing Joke is better, in all honesty. Not because I'm not because I think Alan Moore is the single greatest comic book writer of all time. Possibly, I think the only sort of people that actually can beat the likes of Alan Moore would probably be, oh god, like, I know there's, I get, like, I actually, to be honest, it will come to me at some point when I think, if I can think of people who are better than Alan Moore. But what I'm trying to say is that if you also are familiar with Frank Miller's massive problems when it comes to writing literally anything beyond The Dark Knight Returns, trust me, I need to there is an entire essay's worth of problems to describe people like Frank Miller, because for those people again who don't quite remember, Frank Miller was the man who wrote the absolute disaster that was All-Star Batman and Robin, which is widely considered to be perhaps the worst Batman story, if you could even call it a story, because it literally got canned after 11 issues. And all that time, here's I know we're getting off topic, but you know what? I'm just going to say this right now because this needs to be said. All-Star Batman and Robin was the tale that Batman recruits Dick Grayson literally like 20 minutes after he watched his own parents be murdered. Batman is also this is also the Batman that forced Dick to start eating rats in the Batcave. This is also the same Batman who called Dick the R word just because he didn't like the name Batmobile. This is also the same comic series in which Batman and Robin like take Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern, hostage inside like this rundown flat somewhere in Gotham by painting everything yellow so that Hal was completely useless. This is also the same story in which they pretty much just drew any panel that Black Canary was on panel. She was heavily sexualized. They heavily hammed up her Irish. I don't remember necessarily if Black Canary is like canonically Irish or not. They seem to go a little bit back and forth on this, but they ham it up like you couldn't possibly believe, to the point where even when the point where they sort of try to draw Batman and Black Canary having sex somewhere on the docks in Gotham, it just looks like everything else. It looks incredibly out of place and doesn't look anything that Batman should have been. And then to top this all off, it ends after 11 issues, and there's no conclusion. There's no message. There's no story whatsoever to All-Star Batman and Robin. It is actually almost like fascinating how there is nothing to talk about of any significance whatsoever. Which is ironic, ladies and gentlemen, because there was another comic that was also going out at the same time called All-Star Superman, widely considered to be one of the absolute greatest stories about the Man of Tomorrow. And honestly, go read All-Star Superman instead. It is better in every single way. Is it any better than any of the Alan Moore stories when he's written about Superman, like Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow? It's hard to say, really. Yeah, honestly, it's pretty hard to say. Anyway, among other things that Frank Miller has done, Holy Terror. I don't think I need to summarize it any more than that when it comes to Frank Miller going completely off the rails, but you want to... I don't recommend people look into it, but, well, that kind of like shows you like years of mediocrity, deterioration, and a complete lack of being completely out of touch with reality. Is it to the same extent that Chris is? Well, it's hard to say, really, because it's like the way to describe the deterioration is that they don't necessarily go backwards, but they rather go sideways. Neither going backwards or forwards, but sort of staying a little bit stagnant. The only issue with Chris is that he goes sideways, but it goes up, down, up, down. It's a very inconsistent pattern. Sometimes it will just plateau, but Chris doesn't visibly get better or worse. At best, Chris is sort of in like different places at once, except actually going forward. Because going online and saying that you believe in magic powers is not necessarily taking a step back when it comes to, like mental health or anything like that. But it does go back. It does go back when Chris is openly trusting people who he's specifically been told to not have anything to do with, stuff like that. Sorry, let's. I know I didn't expect to like go on that long, but you know what? It is a fascinating talking point, mental health care, because it's more than just trying to look at the man behind the tinted glasses. It's trying to look at how Chris views the world through his tinted glasses, and not just the glasses that Chris actually wears. We're talking about windows to the soul, how his outlook on the world. And because Sonichu is the literal manifestation of Chris's extension to the real world, well, what do you think this says about Chris when literally you decide to make it a comic that is more centered around your own life and your own disasters than we have credit for? So let's keep going. The 2004 survey. The psychiatrist who compiled a survey of Chris's issues following his troubles at PVCC in 2004 echoed the diagnosis of autism that Chris received sometime in his youth, and took note of an obsessional quality to his preconception with finding a girlfriend, or preoccupation, I should say. He also administered a Folstein test, a brief questionnaire designed to detect cognitive impairment. Chris racked up a perfect score. indicating no problems with his memory or basic information processing abilities. Oh, right, so why doesn't Chris actually act on any of these things? Whether or not Chris legit, or whether or not, like, the things that happened in 2007 onwards, these are the sorts of things that Chris was not prepared for, or something that the Falstein test didn't account for when they were talking about people in the 21st century, or maybe better still, Chris just chose to do the wrong things. Maybe. On the global assessment of functioning, the doctor rated Chris a 70, roughly halfway between an average adult and someone with socially debilitating mental illness. Late onset gender dysphoria. History of medication. According to the 2004 psychiatric survey, at some point in his life, Chris was prescribed the antidepressant medication imperamine. It's not clear when he was prescribed the drug or for what exact reason, but it was likely sometime in his younger days, since the advent of more sophisticated antidepressant drugs like Prozac in the late 1980s, the use of imperamine to treat depression and other psychological disorders has grown less and less common. The same document notes that as of 2004, Chris had been taking the antidepressant Paxil for 4 years in order to deal with his stress and anger issues. One of the survey's recommendations was an increase in his daily dose of the drug, but it's not clear how long Chris continued taking it afterwards. In Mailbag 13, he explained that he had switched to a different medication in order to avoid some of the Paxil side effects, the ones that only hit adults. However, in his 11th call with Casey, Chris said that the drug he switched to from Paxil was paroxetine. Since Paxil is just one of paroxetine's several trade names and not a different drug, it seems that Chris is still taking the same medication, only under a different appellation. Chris didn't specifically or specify what side effects Paxil caused him, but his language suggests that some sort of a sexual dysfunction. Paxil may have been making it difficult for Chris to achieve orgasm. If his current antidepressant is still paroxetine, or at least another SSRI, then it might explain why it took him around 20 minutes in order to climax when he cybered with Julie. I mean, I can't necessarily work out, it's probably no secret that Chris is not necessarily the sort of first person you look at when you think of the words stamina, endurance, or even, discharge, but who am I to start judging, eh? Another of Paxil's more notable side effects is the potential for substantial weight gain, which couldn't have mixed well with Chris's diet and sedentary lifestyle. Past instances of professional help, or lack thereof. One of the most frustrating elements of Chris is his adamant refusal to take help from any source whatever. Well, rather, any source. The only sort of sources Chris does take help from are those who will only use it to play into his delusions and then ultimately betray him. AKA where on earth do we begin? Blue Spike, Casey, Liquid Chris, Alec Benson Leary, Jackie, Catherine, the Idea Guys, Jacob Sockness, Isabella Janke. There's probably a lot more, but those are just many of the names that come to mind. In the aftermath of his suspension from PVCC, his evaluators repeatedly recommended further counselling and psychiatric treatment, but Chris and his parents refused. It seems that Bob thinks that the world of mental health hasn't evolved past the turn-of-the-century treatment of straitjackets and lobotomies. I know that Chris was born in the 80s and stuff like that, and, Bob probably saw the documentary Children of Darkness and thought that is literally all that ever happens, despite the fact that even the things they showed in Children of Darkness were about, even by that point, 30 years out of date. If you ever get the chance, ladies and gentlemen, I recommend going watching Children of Darkness. It is one of the grimmest, but one of the most stunning pieces of like medical. I'd say medical professional knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, to witness, because its issues when it comes to things like schizophrenia and the inhumane treatments that went into trying to educate people like that is, well, I think you're going to have to see it for yourself. The only thing close to therapy that Chris has ever had was a compulsory anger management class, and we all know how much good that did. About the only authority figure he listed to was Rocky Shoemaker, his pastoral counsellor. He claimed that he had no need for psychiatric therapy because his pastor is better at helping him than anyone with, years of training and experience in helping people with psychiatric problems. That's true. He really does think that. Chris and Rocky, however, parted ways in around 2011. He showed repeated disregard for the authority of mental health professionals. It is suspected that, even if Chris received professional help, he would disregard most of it and undermine the therapy. Makes you almost kind of wonder why Chris, why he wasn't blacklisted from therapy and stuff like that if Chris has such a low opinion about them. But I suppose that's kind of like not really fair. But well, it's also not really fair when Chris undermines their professionalism, their ability to help, and Chris prefers listening to himself than anybody else. It seems Chris only acknowledges his personal flaws if they get him pity or to demonstrate that he's beaten them already. Notice how often Chris claims to have won the battle over autism, only to fall back on "I have autism" as an excuse. Similarly, he wrote to Nintendo Power magazine to tell them he conquered his noviophobia, only to say later that his fear came back like a boomerang. Regardless of how blatantly stupid his actions are, regardless of how often trolls, including a 13-year-old, and con artists such as the Idea Guys, trick him into doing horrible things, regardless of how any mental health worker would, worth their salt, would pin Chris down like a butterfly to get a chance to crack open his impenetrable shell of fail. Chris will carry on as usual, justifying away everything that would inconvenience him even slightly. Chris has no problem telling other people to seek professional help. However, in the mailbag, he has occasionally responded to detractors with retorts like, "Go see a psychiatrist." Funnily enough, were Chris to ever see a psychoanalyst, he or she would probably see this as a classic Freudian projection. For what they're worth, ladies and gentlemen, we might actually do an article later on talking about Freudism, specifically so we can talk about it in relation to Chris, because believe it or not, there are some similarities, but that depends if you want to see him that way. Nathaniel Green Elementary School. When Chris attended NGES, there was an incident where he was supposedly restrained or molested, depending on who you talk to. It has been claimed by Bob that they wanted to send Chris to an institution. What they meant was likely a place where Chris could see professionals who could work with Chris's problems as opposed to teachers who deal with normal students. What Bob probably thought is he would be sent to a nut house. Either way, something that could have done some good in his early development didn't happen. Now, this is the sort of thing that's actually quite a lot harder to disprove, ladies and gentlemen, because Chris absolutely could have done with actually seeing some professional help at a young age. Why on earth the state did it? Like, if the school legitimately thought that, regardless of what Bob thought, the Chris would have to seek help to some extent, well, what are you supposed to do about stuff like that, ladies and gentlemen? Because the state can't forcibly take Chris away from his parents, because, of course, Chris's parents are his legal guardians. But what if even the state was not convinced. I'm sure that, like, I'm sure there's never been an incident like something like that's ever happened before, but you've got to think, well, if that's not happened, then, well, why on earth, why go through the problem of trying to introduce that idea, like try to persuade somebody with the idea of that in the first place? But then again, I suppose, again, it would have been their call, but you know who also has, again, now, listen, this may or may not be a thing that actually happens in the United States, but this is absolutely that does happen here in the UK, is that when it comes to a child's well-being, when it comes to their safety, you know who you go to when the child's parents or even their next of kin, even when they're not available? You go to the kid's head teacher of whatever school they're attending of. Yeah, you won't believe it, ladies and gentlemen, but actually there's a tremendous level of responsibility, not only in a professional standpoint, but also from a morality standpoint. A headmaster has got to be absolutely ready to tackle issues that could concern social services or could concern a child's emotional and mental or even physical well-being. There are situations, ladies and gentlemen, and there are far too many that I know of already, but I do certainly know that if the idea that probably go to see psychoanalysts, maybe this was something that Nathaniel Green's head principal, maybe this was their maybe this was their suggestion from the very beginning, but, well, as I said before, if Bob and Bob are saying no, then, well, there's not really much they can do. But I don't know if this, even 40 years later, this is even, like, beneficial to who, because ideally this should be beneficial to Chris before anything else. But because this didn't happen, who are we to say whether or not? But then again, considering that, well, because even when he was young, Chris seemed pretty certain in his own mind. But that's what on earth are you meant to say to that? Either it does or it doesn't do any good. Okay, now that my stomach has had the opportunity to calm down, and now I've sorted my breathing out, and now that my brain is now switched back on at the mains, well, almost. Let's continue. Mary Lee Walsh. Although not a mental health professional, Walsh has experience at dealing with a large body of students and their individual problems. She has also written a book of coping with college life. Despite her advanced knowledge and experience, Chris chose the better path of cursing her and putting her low on his scale of respect. Not that I don't think Mary is, like, well, especially hurt by this, to be fair. Psychiatric papers. Following his outburst towards Mary Lee Walsh, Chris was sent to a psychiatrist for evaluation. The resulting papers easily show a number of things, most of which can easily be told by trolls themselves, or anybody who even has a vague understanding of how bad things look. Another interesting thing is that, despite the encouragement to follow up on this, Chris's parents refused to on the account of insurance problems. They wanted to ensure that they had enough garbage in the house first before they tackled logistics involving, insurance or compensation. This isn't the National Accident Healthline. The documents note that at some point, Chris received psychiatric evaluation at the Center for Learning Potential in Mount Sidney, Virginia, a small town in northeast Augusta County that's 50 miles west of his Ruckersville home. They don't say when this took place, but given the location of the center, it was likely either during his elementary school years or sometime after the Chandlers moved back to Charlottesville in the summer of 2000. Anger management and the shrink. Following his encounter with Mary Lee Walsh, he was ordered to take anger management classes. The only thing that seemed to arise from it were complaints that he had to pay to see a professional, and, well, he still can't control his anger. Mind you, that seems like a particularly good excuse, ladies and gentlemen, to sort of like fall in line. Is that if you don't want to get in trouble with the law, and if you don't want to have to pay a fine, and if you don't want to see a professional, then whatever issues you've got going on in your mind, guess what? Sort them out, or it's going to cost you a lot more than just money. I know that seems like, that seems more like a Canis Canem edit when it comes to psychology, ladies and gentlemen. But, well, again, the whole tough love thing, because, well, again, my approach would have been, Chris, seriously, listen. That would have been my... that would have been how I would have started doing a conversation about mental health with Chris. Yeah, probably not for the best, but you never... How do you know it won't work if you don't try it? There's very little information about his anger management classes, as it occurred in his pre-ED days, and is only mentioned in a few old documents of Chris's that have surfaced. He's never really talked about it since, and it's never come up in comics or videos. Rocky Shoemaker. Religious institutions are fond of providing counselling services to all members of their congregations, sometimes unwisely as a method of hammering them with a doctrine to solve their problems, sometimes beneficially by giving them a person to talk to for free and referring them to a real professional if necessary. Whether Rocky is generally beneficial or harmful to the people who come to see her is uncertain, but she is certainly admired for her past work. What remains certain is that she was probably not the best solution for Chris, because 1. He considered her to be perfect. A perfect, all-encompassing alternative to a certified professional. 2. He barely listened to anything she says. 3. She was not qualified or experienced in dealing with mentally ill people such as Chris. 4. He misconstrued everything she said, accepting advice he liked and ignoring advice he didn't like. She told him about his past habits being unacceptable, but Chris remained as determined as ever to be a total idiot. Although she did put a stop to trolling plans, his behaviour remained the same, and Chris, it was pretty much Rocky who was the one who brought the whole thing about Ivy pretty much to an end, yet Chris was more than happy for just things to continue and to be extorted out of even more money by Joshua Martinez. She also told him it would be a good idea to stop posting videos on YouTube, since they would only feed the trolls. Which, as you might suspected, that hasn't really worked out for the best, has it? About the only thing that he took away from their sessions is that he can fuck someone before they are married. Small deep things, I guess. Relationship management classes. Chris mentioned in a video from October of 2009 and told Casey in a phone call in September that he had been taking some relationship management classes. Undoubtedly, Chris felt that he had found some form of a real-life datehead. In reality, Chris came upon a class meant for couples who wanted to manage their already established relationships as opposed to finding out how to get into one. Because Chris doesn't really bring up any of these things again, even Casey makes mention of it that aren't those sorts of classes specifically for people who are in relationships. Maybe Chris got lost or something like that. Maybe. White Knights and Trolls. It doesn't take a lot of effort for anyone to see that Chris has virtually no common sense. I'll go one further than that, ladies and gentlemen. Even people who don't know will say that Chris has no common sense. That's how... And I've explained previously, ladies and gentlemen, that forget common sense. I think Chris lacks the power of rational thought and logic. I honestly think Chris has issues with those as well, not just common sense. Because common sense, ladies and gentlemen, among many other things, you know what common sense is? It should be the very first thing that comes to your mind. It should be it should be such a natural reflex that it requires no thinking whatsoever. However, considering some of the things that Chris does, it seems to suggest that posting videos about, being listed as a prostitute, or trying to make videos in which Chris tries to admit he's gay. That's apparently the first thing Chris thinks to do, is to actually go along with what they say. Well, why? Why would you do that? It never occurred to Chris at any point to question any of the things that he was told to do or told to say. Why Chris didn't just not do what they say and go and actually spoke to someone who could deal with the situation. I don't know. Maybe a part of this comes from the fact that Chris felt that he could, without getting other people involved. But unfortunately, if this is Chris's attempts at being, manly or sophisticated, well, it hasn't worked, has it? Also, I don't know about you, but this is the first. Is that lamp meant to be at that sort of crooked angle, or was that just by design, or did Chris do something to this? It does look a little bit cramped between this hi-fi anyway, with Optimus Prime standing on top. Likewise, common sense being rather common, white knights and trolls alike often are quick to point out that most of what Chris does is stupid, insane, or socially abnormal. Or probably a little bit of all of them, actually. To put it bluntly, he don't quite get it. As a result, many trolls have become armchair psychologists, pondering why exactly he doesn't get it. Well, for the reasons I've listed before, it doesn't matter what they come up with. The result is always that Chris doesn't listen to anyone if he doesn't want to. Some white knights like Vivian G and Ishal have gotten so fed up with Chris's adamant refusal to improve himself or heed advice that they turned troll or ween instead, or just completely gave up the ghost and served orders to quit and left forever. Court-mandated therapy from 2011 assault and battery case. The conditions of Chris's plea bargain in July 2012 required him to undergo psychiatric treatment and evaluation, but it seems to have had little effect. Court-mandated therapy from 2014 pepper spray case. Chris makes mention of therapy in his video Group Embargo on GameStop, Best Buy, and Simon shopping centres, and it was also reported by observers viewing his July 23 court hearing. The mental health group he attended was On Our Own of Charlottesville. Gender psychologist. During 2016, Chris met with a gender psychologist who referred to him that he is transgender. Chris seemed to have. It could be argued Chris spent more time trying to flex on this issue as opposed to pretty much anything else in regards to things that. Well, then again, I'm not disputing whether or not one is more important than the other, but in point of time, stuff like this should have come afterwards. Until we sorted everything else out. Court-mandated therapy from the 2018 mall trespassing case. Chris was directed to the therapeutic docket program and required to meet with a psychiatrist, and therapy grew up between July 2018 and April of 2019. However, he failed to benefit from the resources, instead retreating further to his imaginary world and the bad actors validating his beliefs. Dr. Wolf. Chris acted out a therapy session with the fictional Brony character Dr. Wolf in the February 2019 video A Moment with Dr. Wolf, Chris Chan, and Greater Struggles. I'm going to be doing a follow-up video to this anyway, because I spent a lot of time talking about it in part I think it was like part 69 of the documentary series, but honestly, this also needs to go further than that. But there you are. Western State Hospital. On the 28th of February 2022, Chris was transferred from Central Virginia Regional Jail to Western State Hospital. While details were initially scarce, Chris eventually confirmed he had been sent there to make him sufficiently competent to stand trial. Notably, the day before Chris returned to jail, staff members pinned him to the floor which reminded him of a similar incident at Nathaniel Green Elementary School. He has gone on record to state that if they aren't wiped out by the dimensional merge, he would sue the mental hospital in retribution. Well, it's been 3 whole years since this has happened, so do you think Chris actually meant any of this, or do you think that do you suppose any of this happened whatsoever? Because, well, where is this source coming from? What's the validation to sources like this? Later on, Chris claimed the Western State Hospital was expected to place him in a group home, but instead sent him back to jail, allegedly to free up a room. Once again, he accused hospital staff of being abusive as fuck and arrogantly shit-minded with their patients. Whether or not any of this is true, given Chris is a known liar, has yet to be proven. And also, when it comes to the Gateway homes, it's a little bit difficult to gauge any sort of perspective, because from what we're concerning ourselves with, there's probably not much to go on apart from the fact that whatever influences Flutter might be trickling into Chris's sphere of influence will only be seen depending on what happens. But there we go. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. That was Chris and mental health care. I certainly hope you guys enjoyed it. I tried to shake things up a little bit by trying to divulge a little bit more into other aspects, things that other people who sort of go down the rabbit hole, who are not necessarily completely unlike Chris, but share enough distinctive or rather negative quirks in their personality that have sort of resulted in... Because, honestly, when I mentioned before about things like Holy Terror, because that seemed to be a story that, honestly, whatever logic... I mean, the logic that went into it is that it was originally supposed to be a Batman story before Frank Miller got, fired from DC, and then he went to All-Star Comics, I think they were called. I'm pretty sure they must have been... that them at DC must have been laughing when that happened. And, well, for those who don't... Honestly, for a better reference, go watch the Linkara episode where he reviews the entirety of Holy Terror. I think it's his 300th episode, but it's good reading. Or rather, Lewis gives better reading, because don't buy that thing. Anyway, with all that being said and done, I hope all of you guys enjoy this, and, well, I'll see all of you guys again next time. So take care, and bye-bye for now.